Welcome to Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. I'm your podcast producer, RJ Malik, and joining me right now is Joline Godfrey. Hello, Joline. It's nice to get together, and let's talk about you and your goals for this podcast. So let's start off by getting to know you. Give us your background.
Oh my. Well, let's say I grew up in a family business. I am trained as a clinical social worker, so I think about the world in a developmental way and I think about what moves people. And some years ago, I had an opportunity to do a project for Inc. magazine that drew on my background in a real way. They asked me to go out and interview women entrepreneurs around the country. I did that. It turned into my very first book, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. But Our Wildest Dreams, Women Making Money, Doing Good, Having Fun was a terrific adventure. It put me on Oprah years ago, which was kind of
Nice.
fun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but what was most interesting is that by the time I finished that project, what I was really curious about is what might have happened to those adult women had somebody talked to them about money when they were little girls. At the time, so this is, a number of decades ago now, um, at the time, nobody was doing that. And the notion of financial education for young people was still pretty nascent. Junior achievement had been around for a very long time, and there were small efforts here and there. But generally, it was really education that was from an accountant's brain, dumbed down a little bit for young people. And it just didn't work. So, again, because I do think developmentally, and I know that just as we teach little ones ABCs and how to work, how to walk and talk and all of that, there probably should have been a model for the developmental approach to financial education, but no one had tackled that.
Hmm.
So that's what I took on, and it has led to a long, winding journey, not always welcomed, I will add.
Not surprised.
Uh, and particularly in the early years when I was focused on financial education for girls, I felt like Cassandra spitting into the wind. I mean, honestly, it was of very little interest. Um,
Times have changed.
Times have changed, and I was smart enough to finally understand that little boys need financial education too.
Yeah, and I wanted to tell you something, and I just found this out recently. Talking with my mother, she's 87 years old, and my dad passed away a couple of years ago. Now she's on her own, and so I make a trip down to Florida where she lives a couple times a year to spend time with her and just keep her company and stuff like that. On a recent trip, she told me that she wanted to be a police officer when she was going to college.
Oh my.
And I had never known this because I knew she was a teacher. She went into teaching. And I said, I thought teaching was what you wanted to do. And she said, no, I wanted to get into law enforcement. But at that time, that was not available to
Not a-
me. So it was either I become a teacher or a
Yep.
nurse. And that was something that I found surprising, and just an aspect of my mom at 87. I'm finding out new things about her, and but so it leads into the fact that we need not only children need more and more
Right.
education, and I know even when I was growing up, I mean, basically my dad wanted me to get into business. You're going into business. You're going into business, and it was not a pleasant experience when I told him I was going into radio.
Right.
He was not happy, and in fact, he told me that he thought, okay, his thinking was, all right, just graduate from college, go into radio and get it out of your system, and then get a real job. That was his
Ugh,
attitude, and that was he basically said that to
yep.
me. But I proved him wrong. I've been in radio for 40 years, and part of the way through, he went from being against it to being one of my biggest backers.
Wow.
getting back to the financial part and why it's so important for, kids to understand and be educated early about finances. So that leads you into why you form this group and form Bounce 10 actually is what you're doing and now doing
Sure,
this
sure.
podcast. You made reference to the early going being a little bit difficult. What were some of the challenges you were facing as you started this project?
Big one, well, there were 2 really. One was when people think about financial education, money comes immediately to mind. And certainly in the early days, I know that families who would invite me in to do something with their family or their young people assumed I would show up with graphs and spreadsheets and tools to teach them about money, which, in fairness, I did and I do. But I have a much what I think of as an expanded notion of wealth. And by that, what I mean is, and again, I will just mention that I'm trained as a clinical social worker and not as an accountant or a financial expert. Um, though I've run a number of companies now, so Lord knows I've had to learn. But that said, when I think about capital, I have a much bigger notion, and I include financial assets, intellectual assets, social and human capital assets. The reason I have embraced this much bigger view is that it got clear to me very early on that you would lose kids if you started to talk about spreadsheets to a 10-year-old or even to a 17-year-old. They didn't care. And the secret sauce for me of financial education has to do with making it relevant, whether you are 5, 15, 25, or 45 for that matter.
Right?
And again, because it starts with who you are and where you are, having that bigger umbrella, that bigger notion of various forms of capital gives you many more starting places. So, if I can start with your intellectual capital, for example, and find out that your passion is in the arts, and you are interested in either being a painter or running a gallery, we can start there because that's intellectual capital that can be used in multiple ways, and we can figure out how to deploy it. And then as you're ready, we can back into the financial skills you're going to need to support that part of your capital.
Okay.
In some ways, I recognize it's deeply subversive. And I think for many families, it doesn't click immediately. It's like, get down to business. What are we talking about here?
Well, yeah, I can see that because that's what I grew up with. My dad was business, business, business.
Exactly.
And so, when I went off into a different direction, it was a challenge for him and for myself. I mean, our
Absolutely.
relationship was a little bit rocky. Now, I contributed to other things that made a rocky relationship. That's a whole different story. But it was a little rocky for a couple of years. But once he realized I was serious about it, and really the turning point was he was visiting my mom and him were visiting me at a Cape Cod where I was working at a
Ah,
radio station, and they stopped at the hotel to check in, and it was off season, so we asked, why are you're here? And they're saying, oh, we're visiting our son. Oh, that's great. What does he do? And they said, oh, my radio name is RJ McKay. So they said, oh yeah, we're visiting our son, and he works in radio. Oh yeah, what's his name? RJ McKay. And the person was like, oh my God, I listen to him all the time.
that's so
And from that moment on, my dad, his perspective changed
yes.
and he understood.
So often it's outsiders who translate to parents what their kids are up to.
Sure.
You
But
know,
that makes sense
yeah,
because the parents are focused on certain things
absolutely.
and they don't see for I hate to say put it this way, but they don't see the big picture or another part of the picture. Maybe that's a better way of seeing it. Another part of the picture, and also generations change.
Yes, absolutely.
My generation is different from my parents' generation. So it's a learning process, and I think sometimes it can be difficult for parents to learn, and it's a challenge. But people like you can, show them the other side of the picture.
I have a lot of compassion for parents. I mean, they get up every morning and do their best. I really believe that. Now, you and I both know there's a slice that don't worry about it too much. But for the most part, I think most parents really are trying hard, but there are so many things coming at them. And they are worried about, how is my child going to survive? How are they going to flourish? How are they going to make it through grade school, middle school, high school, and so on? And they feel the burden of that. And where there appears to be a clear path, they figure out, let's just get down that path. Unfortunately, that path doesn't fit every kid.
Right.
And so, helping, really advocating for the kids, if you will, to make sure they're on a path that is going to be functional and effective for them, but also supporting those parents who are trying their best, is a role that's easier for me to play than it would be either for a spouse or a child to play. And as an outsider, I can offer support, but I can also kind of open the conversation. And really, that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. And it's, of course, why I founded Bounce. So, in some ways, I think of it as translating languages, translating experiences, right at a time when parents' voice tends to be really diminished by influencers, social media, peers, the popular culture, just as kids need their parents' voice the most because it's the most reliable. Those parents care about them. It is harder to hear it because so much is coming in.
Right. And then you're also dealing with the fact that we know that a child's brain, really a human's brain, doesn't really fully develop until your mid 20s.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
You're not dealing with a teenager is not rational. I look back at my teenage years, and I think I actually at one point apologized to my parents because I was not a I was a pain. I really was, and I appreciate the support I got from my parents. So that's it's a huge challenge that I don't think parents understood and still maybe are trying to figure out, especially when you're dealing with a child on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Sometimes it's just like enough.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we are all human, and parents, there are some days that it really is enough, to use your words. The other thing that I think is frustrating in the extreme in families, and I get this, is most families think there must be a class I can send that kid to. There must be a course or a session, and boom, they've got it. I think what's really frustrating, and I get a lot of resistance too, which is why this takes a long time. It's very hard to come to grips with whatever class or course you think that kid is going to benefit from. May work for a period of 4 to 6 months, but then, oh darn, they're older, the culture has changed, there are new things to learn. It is a journey, not an event. And the fact that this is ongoing rather than something that has a beginning and an end has got to be frustrating in the family system where there is so much to handle. And I mean, it's interesting. As you know, Bounce starts with children as young as 4. It is specifically designed for kids between 4 and 10. Obviously, when they come to the end of the Bounce program over time, we have more things for tweens and teens. But getting families to really think about starting early has been one of the great challenges of my career. Because for the most part, families have come to me when there is some kind of drama, when the kid is spending too much, or they're asking questions, or they're being provocative, I mean, a lot of the families I work with, frankly, have a significant amount of abundance that their kids are growing up in. And kids will say to them, for example, well, why can't I have that? You can afford that. You know, it's one thing to be able to say truthfully, no, honey, we can't afford that. It is another to figure out how to put a boundary on a kid when in fact they know your bank account can handle it.
Hmm.
And so you have both the double whammy of abundance complicating your life on the one hand, and that's obviously not true for all families, but it's true for a number of families.
Sure.
And then you have the complication of what worked for the 7-year-old and the 10-year-old is not working any longer for that 15-year-old.
Okay. So you started, when did you start Bounce 10?
Bouncetown is very new. We are just coming out of a really successful beta test, and we are
Okay.
moving into our what I think of as our founding family, very innovative but real live soft launch. So it's new that, but I have been working on it in many ways for 25 years and working very specifically on the venture itself for the last 18 to 20 months. Um, so it's new, but obviously I have a great deal of experience to build on at this point. And the great frustration of the last 20 years for me has been that I've done a lot of bespoke one off programming for very young children. But it's great for that one family. It does not have big impact. And so what I'm thrilled and excited about is that finally I have a product and a program that is much more accessible and that is going to be useful for many more children and many more families.
And just listening to you and how you started and your work, you really have to be aware of social changes. And I think the big issue now is the internet. And when you first started, the internet was not prominent. It was probably in its, infant stages. And now it's such a big part of
Huge.
everyone's life. You have to really almost review what you do and how you go about things and change. So what is your process of how do you do that, I guess is what I'm asking. I mean, what is your philosophy on looking how society and technology is changing and influencing society?
Well, I'll start by saying that I hate change personally. Uh,
Okay.
just hate change. I truly understand.
Don't we all?
Yes, we all hate it. It's really hard. However, I had this marvelous colleague way back in the well, around the late '90s when the internet was just coming on board, and he would say, "I eat change for breakfast." And
Okay.
I remember listening to him, and he was incredibly successful. And I remember thinking, well, that's what I've got to do. Got to eat change for breakfast. And so, as much as I hate change, I force myself to, you know, drink it down. I will say, for I'm seeing what you're talking about up close and personal right now. I am working on the third edition of Raising Financially Fit Kids. The first one came out in 2003. The next one I didn't do until 2013. So we went from, nascent internet to, oh my God, there's just so much going on. And we had just finished the 2008 financial collapse. Talk about differences in financial landscape.
Sure.
And so that second edition was published in 2013. The difference between the landscape in 2013 and today, when money is essentially invisible to children, yet another era that I am trying to prepare that next generation or generations and their families for. Tricky business.
So you really have to pay attention to a lot of different things that will influence a family and children and
Yeah.
parents. I
And
mean, you're managing both parents and children at the same time. Am I
oh,
understanding that correctly?
Precisely, but add one more dimension, which is truly important, and that is grandparents.
Oh,
Turns
yeah.
out grandparents are among my best friends because they are looking at what they didn't have as resources for their own children,
Right.
because it didn't exist. Nobody was paying attention to this stuff. And yet today's grandparents tend to be more worldly, more educated, and they look at those two generations and think, oh my God, we've got to do it now. So there are three groups of people I'm speaking to, and each has a different language and different interests
And different experiences.
and different experiences. Exactly.
Wow,
Exactly.
that is it's a challenge. It must I can imagine sometimes it keeps you up at night as you try to tackle some of these issues, and then there's, when you're dealing with family, you're walking a tightrope.
Whew. Oh
You
my.
know, you really have to have, so I think one of your best attributes I would think would be patience.
Certainly patient, and I have to say it was not something that came easily to me.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think the ability to hear with the third ear is how we were trained when I was, early in graduate school. There is listening, and then there is listening. I have to pay attention to what is not being said.
Right, right,
I mean, you do that in your work as an interviewer.
right.
What is it that you need to draw out that is not coming out in words? Where else are you getting that data?
Sure.
So I would say it's the listening that, you know, puts me to bed early at night.
Okay. Okay. So we've talked about Bounce 10 a little bit, a little bit. You did talk about how it's a project that you've been working on for a while and it's now coming to fruition. Can you go into more detail about
Sure,
Bounce 10 and what you hope to accomplish with it, and you
sure.
know, if people are looking into it, what they can expect?
Sure. Bounce 10 is really a three-part program, and we describe it as a journey, a community, and a box. And very briefly, the journey is the understanding that this is a developmental process. We assign a navigator to each family, and that navigator's job is to really be a stand-in for me and to help the family along as the child is growing and acquiring new skills. Um, the second piece is the community, and the community is a variety of things. It includes master classes that I tend to do, but we also have a family forum in which I bring in many of my colleagues who are world-class experts that are able to share information with parents that they might not otherwise have. I think of Catherine Steiner Adair, who understands so much about the impact of devices on children's brains, for example. And Paul Sullivan, who is working with dads and has a whole other dimension on that. And being able to bring these folks to my audience, I think is a real benefit to the Bounce program. Um, Part of community also is a parenting portal that is pretty robust, pretty juicy, really, because it has lots of videos, articles, classes, live events, all kinds of things. It also has a metric called Money Score that I'm super excited about. We've never had a way really for parents to explain to kids what they want. I mean, it's one thing to say, don't spend too much money, honey. It's another to give them 10 skills and very specific, concrete examples of what it is you want them to learn. Money Score does that. And I'm really excited about that because it's based on the 10 financial skills I talk about in Raising Financially Fit Kids, the book, and gives both parents and kids a place to really focus, a kind of core currency, if you will. And then the third part, this thing I call the box, um, is not exactly the $25 a month art box that may come immediately to mind. The box is probably the most subversive part of the program in that using play as the vehicle for teaching children almost anything. We provide materials for parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles to use with those little ones that are fun. I mean, they look like your ordinary storybooks, puzzles, games, cameras, a whole variety of things. But woven into all of that are things that are going to help advance both the 10 skills and, as I was talking earlier, this notion of an expanded idea of what it means to be wealthy, what it means to be rich. I'll tell you, for example, one of my favorite books is a book called The Table Where the Rich People Sit. And it's about a little 8-year-old girl who calls her mother to the table at breakfast one morning and says, "You and dad need to get a better job. We need more money." And the rest of that conversation and the storybook is about the parents helping her to think about, well, what do you think it's worth that we're able to have time in our lives to take a hike as a family pretty often? What do you think the value of that big blue sky we get to stand under is? And it is a way to teach the notion of human capital, social capital, even intellectual capital. So the box is one that, of course, we're very excited about because it has cool, juicy materials for parents to use. But it does require attention. You know, I will just say you can outsource financial education, but it's not nearly as effective as when parents and kids are directly connected. And we make it possible, even fun, for parents and kids to connect.
That's fantastic. That sounds really good. All right, unfortunately we're running out of time. I've enjoyed chatting with you about this and your project. Is there anything that I did not ask you about that you would like to include it with this?
I think the only other thing I would add is that, you know, today's parents are so busy, so frazzled on so many days. And, you know, they want to do well. And yet when they don't, then they feel guilty about it. And I think one of the things we can offer through Bounce is this sense of you don't have to do everything. You don't have to do everything at once. You do have to do something. Doing something is better than doing nothing.
Okay.
And that's the piece I would like to leave people with.
Excellent. And I would also ask you about contact information. How can people get in touch with you and find out more information about Bounce 10?
Well, our website is just www.bounce-10.com. And I can be reached very easily through Joline at bounce-10.com. I'm also pretty easy to Google, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I do have a Substack, and if you just put in Substack, Joline Godfrey, up comes the Substack related to this. So there are multiple ways to track me down, and I invite families to do that.
And of course, your name is spelled Joline.
Thank you, RJ. Yes, people, Dolly Parton, I love, but for whatever reason, people want me to be JOL the other. I'm not.
Okay. Very nice. Well, thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you about your project and Bounce 10. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you more about it. And I'm looking forward to your guests that you'll have on your podcast. And this is just the beginning, right?
Right, just the beginning. Thank
All
you.
right. Awesome. All right. We're looking forward to your next podcast, and thank you for listening to today's Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with friends and family. Until our next podcast, for Joline Godfrey, I'm RJ Malik.